The coastal town of Halewood looked like a postcard. Rows of pastel-colored houses, trimmed hedges, and quiet streets wrapped around the bay like an old lullaby. But inside one particular house at the end of Elderflower Street, nothing was peaceful. My name is Elara Moore, and I was the second daughter in a home that never had room for two. My mother, Vivian Moore, was the kind of woman people in town idolized, always dressed in soft scarves, her makeup perfectly done, her smile polished like porcelain. To the outside world, she was grace embodied, president of the neighborhood council, host of yearly charity galas, a mentor to young mothers in need. But behind the heavy drapes of our home, Vivian's charm turned to frost. I wasn't part of her vision. My older sister, Celeste, had always been the golden girl, flawless, poised, and obedient. She danced ballet, sang at church, and got straight A's. Me? I liked to climb trees, talk back, and ask uncomfortable questions. That alone made me an inconvenience. The more I grew into my own skin, the more my mother seemed determined to peel it away. From the age of 6, I learned that praise was not meant for girls like me. When Celeste brought home a drawing, it was framed. When I did, Vivian glanced at it and said, "Try staying inside the lines next time." I tried harder, tidying the house, fixing my posture, even mimicking the way Celeste spoke. Nothing worked. If I smiled, it was fake. If I cried, I was weak. If I stayed quiet, I was cold. There was no version of me she could love. My father, Everett, was a gentle soul, but constantly away on business. When he was home, Vivian wore her loving wife mask well enough to keep the peace. I never told him how often she belittled me when no one was looking. I used to think, if I just get older, things will get better. They didn't. By the time I was 18, I had packed my world into a single duffel bag. I didn't leave with anger. I left with silence. I stepped out the door and didn't look back. Vivian didn't hug me goodbye. She just sipped her tea and said, "Don't come crawling back when you realize life isn't as easy as you think." And life wasn't easy. I rented a damp basement room in a crumbling townhouse on the edge of the city. I worked double shifts at a corner diner where the smell of grease clung to my clothes long after I left. I took evening classes and bought groceries in small batches. But none of it broke me. If anything, I felt free for the first time in my life. No one told me how to walk or how to talk or who I needed to become. I didn't need to perform anymore. Then I met him. Nolan was a data technician at a firm I applied to for part-time admin work. He was quiet, observant, and had a knack for fixing broken things, mostly servers and coffee machines, but sometimes people too. We became friends slowly, through awkward conversations by the copy machine and inside jokes over lukewarm cafeteria coffee. I was wary of affection. I flinched when people got too close. But Nolan never pushed. He listened. When I told him about my mother, the way she controlled every detail of my life until there was nothing left to call mine, he didn't try to fix me. He just said, "You're still standing. That means you already won." I think I loved him in that moment. By the time I was 23, we were living together in a modest flat near the harbor. We spent weekends baking bread we always forgot to finish, and weekdays making plans for futures we never thought we'd have. For the first time, I had someone who made me feel like me was enough. A year later, I found out I was pregnant. I was terrified. Not of being a mother, but of becoming her. Would the trauma she buried in me somehow pass on to my child? Would I unknowingly echo her voice when my own child cried too loudly or didn't meet expectations? Nolan sat beside me as I stared at the test, my hands shaking. "This baby is going to be loved," he said softly. "Not because we're perfect, but because we won't lie to them about who we are." I clung to those words. We decided to tell our families over dinner one weekend. Nolan's parents, warm and a bit chaotic, cried and laughed and wrapped me in hugs. My father congratulated me quietly over the phone, his voice full of hesitation. Then there was Vivian. I hadn't spoken to her in 3 years. But I thought maybe, just maybe, the news would stir something in her. A crack in the facade. A hint of real motherly love. Nolan and I drove out to Halewood on a breezy Saturday afternoon. The house looked the same, immaculate, cold, untouched by time. Celeste greeted us first, all smiles and grace. She hugged me, called me glowing, and asked about the nursery colors. I almost believed she'd changed. Vivian appeared like a phantom in silk. She offered Nolan a handshake and gave me a nod. "So," she said. "You're playing house now?" I smiled tightly. "We're expecting. I wanted you to know." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I see." Later, when Nolan stepped outside to take a call and Celeste disappeared into the kitchen, I found myself alone with her. The room went still. Vivian turned to me slowly and said, "You were never meant for this life, Elara. You think you've escaped who you are, but you're still the same mistake I regretted." Before I could respond, before I could even breathe, she took one step forward and kicked me, hard, in the abdomen. The pain hit me like fire. I collapsed onto the floor, arms instinctively wrapped around my stomach, a scream lodged in my throat. My baby. My son. The life inside me. Footsteps thundered in from the hall. Celeste screamed. Nolan burst in. I could hear the world unraveling around me, but all I could think was, please. Please let him be okay. Pain is a strange thing. It has a way of stretching time, of slowing everything around you until all you can hear is your own breath, or the lack of it. That's what I remember first, silence. Then Nolan's voice, sharp and trembling as he dropped to his knees beside me. Elara, Elara, look at me. Stay with me. I'm calling for help." I could feel his hand on mine, feel his panic buzzing under his skin like static. I couldn't speak. My arms were wrapped tightly around my stomach, instinct overriding every thought. I didn't know if I was protecting the baby or myself. Maybe both. From the edge of the room, I heard Celeste's voice break into a scream. "Mom. What did you do?" I wanted to open my mouth, to confirm what they'd just seen, but the pain rolled in like a wave, knocking the air from my lungs. Nolan's voice was in my ear again. "An ambulance is on the way. Just hold on. I'm right here." The next minutes, or hours, blurred into a spinning series of lights, sirens, and hurried footsteps. I was lifted onto a stretcher, cold air stinging my cheeks as we exited the house. Paramedics asked me questions I couldn't answer. I heard one of them mutter, 9 months? We need to move fast." I caught a glimpse of Vivian standing in the doorway, arms folded like she was observing someone else's emergency. Not mine. Not her daughter's. No remorse. No fear. Just that cold, dead calm. At Halewood General Hospital, I was rushed into triage. Monitors beeped wildly around me as nurses moved with practiced urgency. Nolan wasn't allowed past a certain point, so he stood outside, watching helplessly as I disappeared behind a curtain. A young doctor named Patel appeared beside me. "Elara, you're in labor," he said carefully, scanning my chart. "The baby's heart rate is elevated but strong. We'll monitor for internal damage, but we need to act fast." My mind was still fogged with pain, but somewhere inside, a primal instinct rose to the surface. I have to protect him. I have to get him here safely. They wheeled me into a delivery room, hooked up machines, started IVs. A nurse with kind eyes held my hand. "You're going to be okay. You're doing great." I wanted to believe her. A contraction ripped through me, this time full and sharp, and I cried out. Sweat clung to my forehead. My body, battered and bruised, wasn't ready, but my baby was coming anyway. Nolan was finally let into the room. He took my hand, kissed my knuckles, and whispered, "You're the strongest person I know." We labored through it together, 19 agonizing hours. Through the tears, the fear, the guilt that somehow it was my fault for even going back to that house. But when I heard that first cry, loud, clear, and real, it silenced every voice of doubt. "He's perfect," the nurse said, placing a tiny, wrinkled bundle on my chest. "You did it, Mama." Tears flooded my eyes. I looked down into the pink, scrunched up face of my son and whispered, "Hi, baby. I'm your mom." Nolan leaned down beside me, his eyes shining. "Welcome to the world, Orion." The next morning, the sun filtered softly through the hospital blinds. Orion slept soundly in the bassinet beside me, his breathing gentle and steady. I held Nolan's hand and stared at the ceiling, unable to shake the events that had brought us here. "Is she in jail?" I asked quietly. Nolan nodded. "Yes." Celeste gave a full statement. "So did I." "And my father?" "He's on his way. He was out of the country. But he's coming." A strange mix of dread and relief stirred in my chest. My father had always been a ghost in our lives, present in theory, but never in practice. I wondered if he'd even believe it. Later that day, he walked into the room. Older, slower, and clearly shaken. He didn't greet me with flowers or balloons. Just a heavy silence and red-rimmed eyes. "Elara," he said slowly, walking toward my bedside. "They told me what happened." I watched him carefully. "Did they also tell you it wasn't the first time she hurt me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat down, his shoulders hunched. "I failed you. I was supposed to protect you." I turned my gaze toward Orion. "You can still protect him." He followed my line of sight, and for a long time, he just looked at the tiny baby sleeping beside us. Finally, he whispered, "I will." Vivian was formally charged with felony assault and child endangerment. The fact that I had been full-term pregnant when she struck me meant the legal system didn't treat it lightly. With the testimonies from both Celeste and Nolan, there was no denying what happened. There were no excuses left to spin. No polished charm to hide behind. The judge issued a restraining order immediately. My lawyer called it a clean case. But nothing about it felt clean to me. It felt messy, raw, like digging up years of rot and expecting it not to smell. Back home, the nursery Nolan and I had painted in soft seafoam green suddenly felt sacred. Each mobile, each folded blanket, was a small defiance against the violence we had survived. I breastfed Orion in the rocking chair, holding him against my chest like a shield and a promise. He would never know the kind of childhood I had. He would never hear the words, "You're not enough," whispered through clenched teeth. He would never question if his mother loved him. He would know safety. He would know softness. He would know the truth, and never fear it. Celeste visited a week later. She brought soup, a plush whale for Orion, and a face still haunted by guilt. I thought she was controlling, sure. Harsh sometimes. But I didn't know. I didn't see what she did to you. "You weren't supposed to," I said gently. "She wanted one of us to worship her. And one of us to disappear." Celeste looked down. "I let her choose for us." "No. She did that all on her own." We sat in silence for a moment, both changed by the storm, but somehow still standing. "Can I hold him?" she asked softly. I nodded, placing Orion carefully into her arms. She cradled him with practiced ease, and for the first time since we were kids, she looked at me with something real. Not pity. Not superiority. Just sisterhood. A week after Orion's birth, while I was still adjusting to sleepless nights and the fragile beauty of new motherhood, I received a call from the district attorney's office. The case against Vivian had moved swiftly. The combination of medical documentation, eyewitness accounts, and the severity of the attack had made the assault impossible to downplay. They wanted me to prepare a formal statement for the court. Vivian's arraignment was scheduled in 2 weeks, and depending on how she pled, we could proceed straight to trial. The weight of it all sat heavy on my shoulders, not just the legal process ahead, but the flood of memory it stirred. This wasn't just about the attack. It was about everything that led up to it. The years of cold shoulders, whispered contempt, and the pain of being raised by a woman who saw me as her blemish instead of her child. I hadn't seen her since the hospital, where she'd stood in handcuffs and dared to say, "You're ungrateful. I raised you." But she hadn't raised me. She'd survived me. And now the truth was going to be spoken, whether she wanted it to be or not. Preparing the statement was the hardest part. I worked with the prosecutor, a focused and empathetic woman named Marin, who listened without interrupting as I described my life in the Moore household. She didn't flinch at the harshest details. She just nodded, took notes, and said, "Your voice matters. Say what you couldn't say before. This is your chance." So I wrote. Every night, after Orion had been fed and tucked into his crib, I sat at the kitchen table with Nolan at my side and told the truth, on paper, in ink, out loud. I wrote about the birthdays forgotten, the praise withheld, the years of being treated like I was barely a reflection in someone else's home. I wrote about the kick. But more than that, I wrote about the silence before it. Because sometimes silence does more damage than violence ever could. The day of the hearing arrived. I dressed in soft neutrals, nothing flashy, nothing loud. Just enough to feel like myself without looking like someone trying to impress the room. Nolan came with me, holding my hand tightly as we walked into the courthouse. Celeste was there too, sitting in the second row, nervously wringing her hands. My father wasn't present. He had sent a letter instead, one that was submitted to the court as part of the record. In it, he admitted to being absent, to trusting appearances too blindly, and to failing to see the truth about the woman he had married. "Elara," he wrote, "is braver than anyone I know. My only job now is to never let her stand alone again." When Vivian was escorted into the courtroom, my body stiffened. She looked older. Not weaker, not remorseful, just stripped of the carefully curated elegance she'd always worn like armor. No silk scarf. No perfect lipstick. Just a gray suit and eyes that darted away from mine the moment they met. She pled not guilty. Marin stood, voice steady, and listed the charges. Felony assault of a pregnant woman. Child endangerment. Attempted harm of an unborn child. Domestic violence with aggravated circumstances. The judge asked if I wanted to read my statement aloud. I nodded. The room fell into silence as I walked to the podium. "My name is Elara Moore," I began. "And I'm here because for 25 years, I was invisible in the house where I should have been safe." Vivian didn't move. She stared straight ahead like I was a stranger on the street. I was told I wasn't enough. I was told to be smaller, quieter, better. I lived in a home where love had conditions, and kindness came with strings. And when I finally found happiness, when I was ready to become a mother myself, the person who gave me life tried to take mine away. I paused. A few people in the courtroom wiped their eyes. Celeste sat frozen, jaw tight. "I am not here today just because of a kick. I am here because that kick was the final act of a pattern that started when I was too young to know what abuse even meant. And I will not be silent anymore." I stepped down, walked back to my seat, and sat beside Nolan, whose hand closed over mine like a promise. The hearing didn't last much longer. The judge, a man with graying hair and a calm but stern voice, denied bail. Vivian would remain in custody until the official trial. And for the first time in my life, I watched her be held accountable. Back at home, I didn't cry. Instead, I held Orion against my chest and whispered, "You'll never have to wonder if you're loved." That week, Lily stopped by with her suitcase. "I broke the lease on my apartment," she said. "If it's okay, I want to stay nearby, be a part of Orion's life." "You don't have to make up for anything," I told her. She shook her head. "It's not about making up. It's about being present now. For him. For you. For me." I nodded. And for the first time since we were children, I felt like we were finally sisters. A month later, the DA's office offered Vivian a plea deal, reduced sentence in exchange for a full admission of guilt. She refused. Of course she did. Vivian had built her life on illusions. On being admired, envied, and untouchable. Admitting she had done wrong would unravel the identity she had spent decades curating. But the trial was coming. And this time, the illusion wasn't strong enough to save her. The morning of the trial was cold and gray, like the world itself was holding its breath. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the blazer Lily had helped me pick out the night before. My reflection stared back, older than I remembered, but stronger too. Motherhood had carved something fierce into my bones, something I hadn't known was there until it had to be. Orion stirred softly in his crib, still sleeping, his tiny chest rising and falling like ocean waves. I brushed my fingers across his soft cheek and whispered, "You'll never see me break for her again." Nolan stood in the doorway, tie half tied, worry tucked beneath his calm expression. "Are you ready?" I took one last breath and nodded. More than ever. The courtroom was packed. Not because Vivian Moore was a celebrity, but because the town of Halewood ran on curiosity, and this trial was gossip made real. There were whispers the moment I entered, eyes that darted away when I met their gaze. No one had ever dared to challenge Vivian publicly. She was the queen of charity galas and garden parties. People didn't know what to do now that the mask had cracked. Vivian sat at the defendant's table, spine straight, chin high. But something had changed. She looked brittle. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. Her lawyer, an older man with a voice like gravel, leaned in close, but she barely nodded. The prosecution called their first witness. It was Celeste. She walked with her head high, in a modest navy dress, no makeup, just raw truth. Her voice didn't shake once. "I witnessed my mother kick Elara in the stomach," she said. Elara was 9 months pregnant. There was no provocation. It was deliberate, and I saw it happen. The room was silent. When cross-examined, the defense tried to poke holes. "Would you describe your mother as mentally unstable?" Celeste frowned. "No. My mother is fully in control of her actions. She always has been. That's the problem." Next, Nolan took the stand. He described how he'd found me on the floor, the 911 call, the ambulance ride. He spoke with clarity and control, but when he talked about Orion, how terrified he'd been that our son wouldn't make it, his voice broke for the first time. "I held her hand the whole ride," he said. "And I prayed we hadn't already lost him." Then it was my turn. I walked to the stand, my pulse thrumming in my ears. For a moment, I met Vivian's eyes. She didn't flinch. She looked at me like I was still the girl who ruined her carefully crafted life. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was a mother. A survivor. A woman who had found her voice. I never expected love from her, I told the court. But I never expected hatred either, not the kind that hides behind smiles and slips into your bones slowly over the years until you don't know what being wanted even feels like. I told them about my childhood. The favoritism. The gaslighting. The emotional starvation. How she twisted the narrative at every turn until I began to believe I was the problem. Then I described the day of the attack. Word for word. Moment for moment. How I'd believed, even then, that maybe some part of her would soften when she heard she was going to be a grandmother. She looked at me, I said quietly, and asked, "Why did it have to be you?" And then she kicked me. Not because she snapped. But because, to her, my happiness was an insult. When I stepped down, the judge gave me a small nod. He had daughters. I could see it in his eyes. The defense tried its best to spin the narrative. Vivian Moore is a respected member of this community. She has no prior history of violence. The incident was a moment of emotional strain, an accident. But the evidence didn't lie. The medical reports showed blunt force trauma consistent with a direct kick. The police body cam footage from the night of the arrest showed Vivian denying everything, even as I was being carried out on a stretcher. And most damning of all, the voicemail. 2 days after Orion was born, before we'd blocked her number, she'd left me a message. "You've ruined everything. He should have been Celeste's child. You think this makes you special? You've always been the mistake." Marin played the recording in court. Vivian went pale. Even the jury winced. In closing arguments, Marin stood tall before the courtroom. "This isn't about one violent act," she said. "It's about a pattern of abuse. A woman who believed control was the same thing as love. who heard her daughter her entire life, and when that daughter finally found something beautiful, something hers, she tried to take it away. She turned toward the jury. Elara didn't break the chain. She shattered it. And that kind of courage deserves justice. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. Vivian was found guilty on all charges: felony assault, attempted harm of an unborn child, and domestic violence with aggravated circumstances. She was sentenced to 4 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 2, and a permanent restraining order barring her from any contact with me, Orion, or anyone in our family. There was no outburst. No apology. Vivian stood as they handcuffed her, turned to me one last time, and said nothing. I didn't need her to. I would never need her again. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds. Nolan slipped his hand into mine, and Celeste leaned against my other side, her head resting lightly on my shoulder. "It's over," she whispered. "No," I said. "It's finally beginning." 3 months after the trial, our home no longer felt like a sanctuary just for survival, it felt like a place where life could bloom. Orion had begun to laugh. Not just tiny giggles, but full-bodied baby belly laughs that echoed through the apartment like music. Every time I heard it, I felt something deep within me loosen, a knot that had been tied there since childhood. The knot of silence. Of fear. Of never being enough. Now, I knew I was more than enough. I was his mother. And that meant everything. We hosted Orion's 6-month celebration in the backyard of our building, where a few trees arched overhead and the scent of jasmine lingered in the breeze. It was a small gathering, just the people who mattered. Nolan grilled while Susan, his mother, bustled around arranging cupcakes and plates of fruit cut into stars. She'd knitted Orion a tiny cardigan the color of the sky. "He's going to need it when fall comes," she said with a wink. "My boys always catch colds when the leaves turn." Lily arrived carrying a framed photo of our parents from years ago, back when we were children, and still smiled for the same camera. She set it on the table beside the gifts but turned the frame to face the trees. "We keep what's useful," she said softly. "We turn away what isn't." David arrived last, bringing homemade lemonade and a story about the first time he changed a diaper back in the 80s. Orion listened like it was the greatest tale ever told. We laughed. We ate. And we didn't talk about Vivian once. It wasn't necessary. Her absence had become just another space we no longer felt the need to fill. At night, when Orion finally slept, I often sat alone in the nursery. The walls were painted a soft pale blue, the ceiling dotted with glow-in-the-dark stars. I'd installed them myself during the last weeks of pregnancy, just me, a stepladder, and a brush full of hope. Now, those stars glowed above his crib like silent witnesses to our journey. One night, Nolan found me there with Orion in my arms, both of us watching the ceiling. He knelt beside me and whispered, "You're different now." In a good way. I nodded. "I finally believe I get to have this. A real life. A soft one." Nolan kissed my forehead. "You didn't just survive her, Elara. You outgrew her." I began attending a local support group for women who had survived familial abuse, daughters, sisters, mothers themselves. Some had fled in the dead of night. Others had endured in silence for decades. Each story was different, but familiar. Their words mirrored my own journey, piece by piece. At first, I was hesitant to share. But one afternoon, a woman named Raina, about my age, with tired eyes and a trembling voice, told a story about how her mother used to hide bruises with kindness. How no one had believed her until she stopped asking to be believed. Something cracked open in me. When it was my turn to speak, I said, "I used to think silence was strength. That not crying, not telling, made me brave. But silence was what she gave me. I don't want to carry her weapon anymore." Raina reached across the circle and took my hand. I knew then, we were never really alone in this fight. There were more of us than the world would admit. Around Orion's first birthday, I received an unexpected letter. It was from the State Corrections Department. Vivian had submitted a formal request to speak with me. Not in person, but via letter or monitored video call. I sat with it in my lap for over an hour before saying a word. Nolan watched me carefully. "You don't have to read it," he said. "And you don't owe her anything." "I know," I replied. "But I need to decide from strength, not fear." That night, I wrote a letter of my own. I didn't address it to her. I addressed it to me. To the girl I used to be. To the woman I had become. In it, I wrote, "You are not a mistake. You are not what she said you were. You are proof that pain can turn into purpose. That love, when chosen freely, is more powerful than anything forced or manipulated. You broke the cycle. And you are raising a child who will never doubt that he is wanted." Then I folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and placed it in a keepsake box labeled for Orion, one day. As for Vivian's request, I declined it. Some voices don't deserve to echo anymore. Years passed. Our apartment grew tighter, so we bought a small cottage on the outskirts of Halewood, with a garden and a creaky porch swing. Orion learned to walk in the wild grass behind the house, chasing butterflies with a toddler's uncoordinated joy. Lily lived only 10 minutes away and visited often. David started teaching Orion chess by the time he was 4, though he mostly used the pieces as rocket ships. One evening, I stood by the fence watching Orion run through the backyard with a wooden sword, cape billowing behind him. He turned and shouted, "Look, Mama! I'm saving the world." And I believed him. Because in many ways, he'd saved mine. Nolan came outside with 2 mugs of tea and handed me one. "Do you ever think about what she'd say now?" I shook my head. "She's not part of the story anymore. Not the way it matters." He smiled. "Then what is the story?" I looked out over the garden, wild with daisies, messy and full of life. And I answered, "This. This is the story." In time, Orion would learn where he came from. About Vivian. About what I survived. But he wouldn't learn it through fear. He'd learn it through truth. Through compassion. Through the power of saying, "This was the past. And we grew beyond it." I would teach him that love is a choice, not an inheritance. And that healing is a process, not a destination. Most of all, I would teach him that even broken things can bloom again, especially when they're planted in better soil. And I would never stop tending that garden. Not for him. Not for me. But for all the daughters who thought they had to stay silent. Because now, we know better. Now, we speak. And now, we are free.